All right, welcome to the deep dive where we take a big stack of research and we pull out all the really important stuff just for you, the learner. Think of it kind of like we're doing the reading so you don't have to. And today we're going to jump into some ideas from a while back, but that still really matter for how we think about education.
Yeah, that's right. This deep dive is going to focus on an article from 1990. It was published in the Educational Psychology Review, and it's called Educational Reform: Implications for Educational Psychologists. It was written by Stephen L. Benton and Kenneth B. Hoyt. And what's interesting is this article, it's not actually putting forward a whole bunch of brand new reforms. Instead, it's taking a really close look at some big reform ideas from the mid-1980s and thinking about, how they might actually play out, what their impact might be.
Okay, so to understand this article, we really need to look at two major reports that came out in 1986. The first is Tomorrow's Teachers by the Holmes Group, and the second one is A Nation Prepared: Teachers for the 21st Century. And that was put out by the Carnegie Forum on education and the economy. And, you think back to the 80s, there was this real sense that something needed to change in education. Part of that was because of A Nation at Risk, which came out just a few years before.
Exactly. And these two reports, Tomorrow's Teachers and A Nation Prepared, they both had the same goal of, trying to improve teaching, to make it better, but they came at it from different perspectives. The Holmes Group was really interested in the structure of teacher education and how rigorous it was. But the Carnegie Forum, they were more focused on how education connects to the economy, how strong the connection was.
Right. So on this deep dive, we're going to make sure you understand what these reports were really saying. And just as importantly, we'll look at how different educators responded to these ideas back then. It's like a window into how people were thinking about teacher education. So maybe we should start with the Holmes Group. Could you tell us a bit more about who they were?
Sure. So the Holmes Group, it started out as a group of education deans from 17 different universities. They began meeting in 1983. And their name actually comes from Henry Holmes. He was the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education way back in 1927. And even back then, he was saying that teacher education needed to be better. So, the Holmes Group, they were trying to carry on that work.
Wow. So this is a concern even way back then. So what exactly were the Holmes Group proposing? What did they think needed to change?
Well, the article talks about 5 main areas where they called for action. First, they wanted teacher education to be more, intellectually rigorous. That meant teachers would need a really strong foundation in the liberal arts and sciences, and they'd also need very specific training on how to teach their subjects. That's what they called subject matter pedagogy. So, think about a history teacher. They wouldn't just know history facts. They'd understand how people learn history and how to teach it effectively. The Holmes Group also wanted teachers to have a lot more hands-on experience in real classrooms as part of their training.
Right. So a good mix of theory and practice. What else did they want to change?
The second thing they proposed was differentiating teacher roles. They realized that not all teachers have the same level of experience or take on the same responsibilities, right? So they wanted to create different roles and certifications for teachers. They envisioned 3 levels: instructors, professional teachers, and then career professionals. Instructors would have a liberal arts degree, and they could teach for a while, but they'd need supervision. Professional teachers would be, experts in their subject and in teaching. Career professionals would do things like curriculum development or designing assessments or even research. This idea was kind of like how doctors have different specializations and levels of training.
So like a career ladder for teachers. Interesting. Okay, so what about making sure that all teachers had a certain level of competence?
That was their third proposal. They wanted to create professional teacher examinations. These exams wouldn't just test a teacher's knowledge of their subject. They'd also test things like writing and speaking skills and the specific methods for teaching that subject.
A much more comprehensive evaluation then. What was their fourth idea?
Their fourth proposal was about strengthening the connection between universities and public schools. They suggested creating professional development schools. This would be like teaching hospitals, for doctors. The idea was that university faculty and school staff would work really closely together. This partnership would benefit both the university and the schools and also boost research on education.
Yeah, I see. Really bringing the theory and the practice together. Okay. And what was the last proposal from the Holmes Group?
Their fifth proposal focused on changing the professional roles of teachers. They argued that teachers should have more authority and autonomy, especially in those professional development schools, so they'd have more say in things like budgets and staffing.
So the Holmes Group wanted to make some pretty big changes to both how teachers are trained and how they work within the school system. Okay, now let's talk about that Carnegie Forum report. A Nation Prepared. You said it had similar goals to the Holmes group, but a different emphasis. What was that difference?
Right. The Carnegie Forum, they agreed with the Holmes Group on a lot of things, but their report, A Nation Prepared, Teachers for the 21st Century, was especially focused on the connection between education and the economy. They were really responding to the A Nation at Risk report, and they were worried about the United States staying competitive globally. They argued that the jobs of the future would require more knowledge and skills, so improving teaching was essential for preparing the workforce.
So basically they were saying that better teachers would lead to a stronger economy. What exactly did they propose?
They outlined 7 main objectives for reform. First, they called for creating a national board for professional teaching standards. This board would set really high standards for what teachers should know and be able to do, and they'd also certify teachers who met those standards. This was meant to be, a gold standard for teaching.
A national marker of quality. Okay, what else?
Second, they also wanted differentiated staffing, like the Holmes Group, but they envisioned a more detailed system with 5 tiers. There would be support staff, licensed teachers, advanced certificate holders, certified teachers, and lead teachers. Each tier had different qualifications and responsibilities, so it was a very structured approach.
A more granular approach than the Holmes Group's 3 tiers. What was their third objective?
Their third objective was pretty radical. They said that all prospective teachers should have to get a bachelor's degree in the arts and sciences before they could start their teacher training. Basically, they were suggesting that the traditional bachelor's degree in education might not be enough anymore. They even went so far as to recommend a specific Common Core curriculum for undergraduates, with courses in history, government, science, the arts, and literature.
So a really big shift in how we think about teacher preparation. What was next?
The fourth objective built on that idea. They proposed a new graduate curriculum leading to a master's degree in teaching. This program would be grounded in research on learning and teaching, and it would also include practical internships with experienced teachers.
So all teacher training would be moved to the graduate level. That's a big change.
Okay.
What about their 5th objective?
Their 5th objective was about diversity. They wanted to attract more minority students to teaching, so they recommended creating partnerships between schools, universities, and even businesses to support those students.
A focus on equity in the teaching profession. What about their 6th objective?
Their 6th objective was about teacher incentives and productivity. They thought the existing system didn't do a good job of rewarding the best teachers, so they proposed linking teacher incentives to student performance. They also wanted to give schools more flexibility in managing resources, maybe by setting goals or letting teachers have more control over their work.
Okay, so tying teacher rewards to student outcomes. That's still a big topic today. And what about their final objective?
Their 7th objective was about teacher salaries. They argued that teacher pay should be more competitive with other professions that require similar levels of education. They recommended pay scales that took into account a teacher's experience, certification level, and even their productivity.
Right, so attracting talent to the profession. Now, the article makes a really important point here. It acknowledges that a lot of experienced educators might have been skeptical about these reform proposals. They'd seen a lot of reforms come and go without much real change.
Yeah, exactly. The article even quotes Nisbet and Collins, who said that it is not easy to change educational principles and methods which are well entrenched and sanctified by tradition. And, educational institutions, they tend to be resistant to change. It's just their nature.
Right.
They brought up the example of how teachers were still using recitation, even though research showed it wasn't very effective.
Yeah, it's hard to break old habits. So did these Holmes and Carnegie reforms actually have any impact?
Well, the article does point to some early signs of impact. The Holmes Group, they were very active. They set up committees, created regional groups, and developed ways for universities to track their progress. They also started a fellowship program for minority students, held a big conference, and got funding from foundations and the government.
So they were putting in a lot of effort to push for their ideas. What about the Carnegie Forum?
The Carnegie Forum's report also led to some concrete action. The NEA started encouraging teacher-led standards boards, which aligned with Carnegie's call for national certification. And there were initiatives for mentoring new teachers and providing them with more support. The Carnegie Corporation also funded the development of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and research on teacher assessment. And they worked with state governors to implement their ideas.
So both of these reports were creating a buzz and leading to real changes. Now, this article is specifically about educational psychology, right? So how did these reform proposals connect to that field?
Yeah, so the article goes back in time a bit and reminds us that even in the early 20th century, there were already people calling for university professors and school teachers to work together to improve education. It mentions Charles W. Eliot, William James, and G. Stanley Hall, who were all influential thinkers back then. Then it talks about how educational psychology emerged as a field of study, thanks in part to E.L. Thorndike's textbook. And since then, educational psychologists have been leaders in areas like child development, testing, counseling, and designing instruction.
So they've already been making important contributions to education, but why should academic educational psychologists care about these specific reforms? I mean, they're mostly focused on research and graduate students, right?
Well, both reports recommended increasing graduate-level coursework on topics related to educational psychology, like research on teaching and learning, human development, and assessment. If those recommendations were implemented, it could really elevate the status of educational psychology within universities and maybe even create more jobs.
I see. More recognition and more opportunities. What else in the reports was relevant to educational psychologists?
Those professional teacher exams that we talked about, educational psychologists could play a big role in developing and implementing those. They have the expertise in test design and measurement.
Right, their skills would be in high demand. But what about the Carnegie Forum's proposal to maybe phase out the undergraduate education degree? That could have a big impact on educational psychology faculty, right? Because they teach a lot of those undergrad courses.
That's a really good point. It's something that educational psychologists would need to think carefully about because it could change their roles within universities.
Yeah, a potential challenge for the field. But the article also sees these reforms as a big opportunity for educational psychologists.
Absolutely. Both the Holmes Group and the Carnegie Forum, they really emphasize the need for collaboration between different departments within universities. Educational psychologists could be really important bridges between education departments and other departments like psychology. They have knowledge and skills that could be really valuable in redesigning curricula and developing those national teacher exams.
So a chance to become even more influential. Now, the article goes on to describe a study that Benton and Hoyt conducted to see how people felt about these reform proposals. Why was it so important to understand how different groups felt about the reforms?
Well, they realized that if these reforms were going to succeed, they needed broad support from the people who would actually be implementing them. You can't just force change on people. The article even quotes UNESCO, saying how important participation is for reform to be successful.
Right, you need buy-in from the people on the ground.
Exactly. And social systems, especially education systems, they don't like to change. Remember the example of recitation? Well, policy statements don't always translate into real change in practice. You need people to be on board.
Okay, so who did Benton and Hoyt include in their study? Who are these key groups?
They focused on three main groups. First, they surveyed the members of the Holmes Group, because they were the ones who created those reforms. Second, they surveyed members of Division 15 of the APA, which represents academic educational psychologists. And third, they surveyed members of TESCU, the Teacher Education Council of State Colleges and Universities. TESCU represents a lot of institutions that are really focused on teacher training, and a lot of those institutions weren't part of the Holmes Group.
Okay, so they got perspectives from the reformers, the experts, and the people who actually train teachers. It's interesting that the article mentions there were some criticisms of the Holmes and Carnegie proposals even before this study. What were some of those criticisms?
Yet not everyone was happy with these ideas. Some people criticized the Holmes Group for being too exclusive and for not representing the full diversity of teacher education institutions. TESCU, for example, had their own ideas about how to reform teacher education. So there was already some disagreement before the study even began.
Okay, so why did Benton and Hoyt choose those three groups specifically?
They chose those three groups because they were the key players. The Holmes Group was pushing for the reforms. TESCU represented a large part of the teacher education landscape, and Division 15 had the expertise in learning and teaching. They figured that if there was a lot of disagreement between these groups, the reforms would probably fail.
That makes sense. So how did they actually measure people's agreement with the reforms?
They started by doing a very careful analysis of the Holmes Group's report and the Carnegie Forum's report. They identified all the key proposals in those reports, and then they created a big survey with 149 different statements. People could say how much they agreed or disagreed with each statement on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And they grouped the statements into 8 different categories. Then they mailed out the survey to members of the 3 groups during the spring and summer of 1987.
That's a lot of data. What were their response rates like?
Yeah, it was a lot of data. The response rate from Division 15 was about 51.8%, which is pretty good for a survey like that. The Holmes group had a higher response rate, 72%. And Teskew, they got a lot of responses, although their sample wasn't perfectly random. But it still gave them a good sense of what teacher educators were thinking.
Okay, so what did they find when they analyzed all that data?
Well, they used a statistical method called factor analysis to identify the main themes in the data. And they found three main factors, or themes, that captured how people felt about the reforms. They called those factors incremental changes, sweeping changes, and financial changes.
Okay, I'm curious to hear what those factors mean. What were the incremental changes?
The incremental changes were things that could be done without making huge changes to the system. So things like stricter certification requirements, more accountability for teachers, better clinical experiences for student teachers, more collaboration between education and liberal arts departments, recruiting more minority teachers, and higher salaries. These were mostly things that people agreed on. In fact, the article quotes some of the survey items that fit into this factor. Things like teachers need a command of the subjects they teach, or we need a strengthened, not watered down, liberal arts curriculum. Pretty basic stuff, right?
Yeah, things that most people would probably agree with. What about the sweeping changes? Those sound more drastic.
Yeah, the sweeping changes were much more radical. The main one was the idea of getting rid of the undergraduate education degree and moving all teacher training to the graduate level. So future teachers would first get a liberal arts degree, and then they'd get a master's in teaching.
That's a huge change. And then what were the financial changes?
The financial changes were proposals that focused on giving teachers more control over money and resources. So things like giving teachers more input on school budgets and letting them have more autonomy in how they work.
Okay, so how did the three groups feel about those three factors? Did they agree or disagree?
Well, they did some statistical analyses to compare the groups, and they found that the Holmes group was more supportive of both the incremental changes and the sweeping changes compared to Tesco. And the educational psychologists in Division 15, they were also more in favor of the sweeping changes than Tesco.
Interesting. So some differences in how the groups viewed those big changes. Did they find any differences within the groups? Like, did people's backgrounds or experience matter?
Yeah, they looked at some demographic factors. They found that the technical folks had more experience on average. And they noticed that the educational psychologists in Division 15 mostly worked with grad students, while the TechSU folks were more focused on undergrads. Within Division 15, the learning psychologists were more agreeable to the incremental and financial changes than the statisticians and measurement folks. For the Holmes group, the only thing that mattered was experience. Less experienced people were more in favor of the financial changes. Within TechSU, women were more favorable to the sweeping and financial changes, and that might be because more women in TechSU worked with undergrads. And interestingly, the educational psychologists within TechSU, they were actually the least supportive of the incremental changes.
Wow, so a lot of variation within the groups too. So how did the authors of the article make sense of all these findings?
Well, they thought that the fact that so many people agreed on those incremental changes meant that the Holmes and Carnegie reports were partly about reinforcing core professional values, presenting a positive image of teaching. And even though those changes were pretty basic, the Holmes group was still really enthusiastic about them.
Right, like they were trying to make a statement about what teaching should be. And what about the sweeping changes, like abolishing the undergraduate education degree?
Those were definitely the most controversial. The Holmes group and Division 15 were kind of on the fence, but TechSU was very much against them. And the authors thought that might be because TechSU members had more experience and because they were so focused on undergraduate teacher training. But he also pointed out that there was some opposition to getting rid of the undergrad degree in all three groups.
Yeah, a really big point of contention. And what about those financial changes? How did the authors explain the different levels of support for those?
They thought that the Holmes group's greater support for those financial changes reflected this broader debate about how to improve teacher quality. Some people thought that giving teachers more control over money and resources would make them more effective and encourage them to stay in the profession. But the authors also cited some research suggesting that money isn't the only thing that keeps teachers happy. Things like being able to transfer to different schools or move to different locations also matter.
It's complicated, right? There's no one-size-fits-all solution. So what were the authors' main conclusions about all this variation in opinions?
They concluded that these differences really reflected different perspectives and priorities within the education community. People's experiences, the types of students they worked with, their professional affiliations, all those things mattered. And they were careful to point out that they did a lot of statistical analyses. So there's always a chance that some of their findings were flukes.
Right. Always a possibility with statistics. So what were their final recommendations? What did they think should happen next?
They were a little concerned about the Holmes group being too elite and not representing all teacher educators. They pointed to the differences in how the Holmes group and TechCU felt about getting rid of the undergrad degree, as an example. They also worried that the Holmes group's proposals might marginalize institutions that were focused on undergraduate teacher training.
So a potential for creating even more division.
Exactly. So they urged the Holmes group and TechCU to work together and find some common ground. They also expressed concern about the relatively low response rate from the educational psychologists in Division 15. It seemed like maybe they weren't as engaged in this reform debate as they could be. And they talked about this tendency for educational psychologists to be more reactive than proactive, to wait for things to happen instead of shaping the conversation.
Yeah, a call for them to step up and take a more active role.
Right. So their main recommendation was that educational psychologists should get more involved in the reform process. They should focus on those incremental changes that everyone agreed on, and they should work to build bridges between education departments and liberal arts departments. They even suggested that educational psychologists could take the lead in developing courses on how to teach specific subjects effectively, based on the latest research in cognitive science. But they acknowledged that getting different departments to work together can be tricky.
Right. Sometimes those disciplinary boundaries are hard to cross. What other recommendations did they have?
They thought that educational psychologists should do more research with teachers in public schools. That would make their research more relevant, and it would give grad students opportunities to work on real-world problems. They also thought that EdD programs should be more flexible so that teachers could get their doctorates while still working. And they suggested that Division 15 should create a task force to study the Holmes and Carnegie proposals, survey educational psychology departments, and write a position paper on how to update graduate training in educational psychology.
Some concrete steps for the field to consider.
Yeah. And they ended by saying that educational psychologists need to be more proactive and shape the future of teacher education. They shouldn't just wait for others to make decisions. Real reform requires action.
A powerful message. So to sum up, we've looked at two influential reports from the 1980s, Tomorrow's Teachers and A Nation Prepared, that wanted to change teacher education in America. We also discussed a study by Benton and Hoyt that examined how different groups of educators felt about those reform proposals. And finally, we explored the specific implications of those reforms for the field of educational psychology.
Yes, and you, the listener, now have a much better understanding of these important debates.
So here's something to think about. We've been talking about reform ideas from decades ago, but how do those same ideas connect to the challenges we face in education today? What's changed and what hasn't? It's worth reflecting on. And if you're really interested, you could even read those Holmes and Carnegie reports yourself or learn more about educational psychology.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time.